The atmosphere inside the studio was electric, almost tense, as the cameras rolled and the live audience buzzed with anticipation. Tonight was not an ordinary night on Stephen Colbert's show. There was an undercurrent of something sharper, something unspoken lingering in the air. Karoline Leavitt, a rising political figure known for her unapologetic views, had been invited as a guest. What no one knew yet was how quickly the night would veer into uncharted territory. At first, the conversation followed the usual pattern. Colbert threw out a few jokes, Karoline answered with her usual poised confidence, and the crowd laughed on cue. But then, with a slight narrowing of his eyes and a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, Colbert shifted the tone. His gaze dropped to the small silver cross that Karoline wore around her neck, glinting under the bright studio lights. "So, Karoline," he began, voice dripping with playful mockery, "is that cross a political statement too? Or just for show?" The audience chuckled uneasily, unsure whether to laugh or brace themselves. Was he really going there? Was Stephen Colbert, the seasoned king of late-night commentary, truly about to challenge a guest's religious symbol on national television? The tension thickened. Karoline paused, her hand instinctively brushing the cross at her neck. For a split second, there was silence. A heavy, breathless moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. Viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens. Would she back down? Would she ignore it? Would she fire back? Why had Colbert chosen this moment, this symbol, as the hill to battle on? Was it a simple attempt at humor gone too far, or a calculated move to expose something deeper about Karoline's beliefs? Was it even about her at all? Or was it a shot at something bigger, something more fundamental about faith and public life? Karoline's eyes locked onto Colbert's, with a calmness that was almost unsettling. She knew exactly what was happening. This was not a random jab. It was a test, a provocation wrapped in a joke, baited for a viral moment. And in that moment, she had a decision to make. Would she retreat into the safe script that so many guests fell back on when the heat turned up? Or would she meet the moment head-on and risk everything? The audience grew restless, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. The air practically crackled with the weight of it. What would she say? How would she respond when her personal symbol of faith, something sacred and untouchable, was thrust into the center of a public spectacle? Karoline's lips parted, and the first words that emerged were not defensive, nor were they angry. They were measured, deliberate, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had been underestimated one too many times. And just like that, the energy in the room shifted. A simple, thoughtless jab had ignited a confrontation that no one, least of all Colbert, was prepared for. Would the late-night legend maintain control of his stage, or was the tide about to turn in a way that would leave him scrambling for balance? Could Karoline transform what was meant to shame her into a moment of undeniable strength? The next words out of her mouth would change the night forever. The live studio audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. Karoline's response was immediate, yet every word was delivered with a composed clarity that made the tension all the more palpable. She looked directly at Colbert, her voice calm, but firm. "I wear this cross because it's a part of who I am," she began, the simplicity of her words hanging in the air like a challenge. "It's a symbol of my faith, not something I'm hiding or trying to use for political points. But it seems like you want to make it into something else." There was no hesitation in her voice, just raw, unfiltered truth. As the crowd absorbed her words, the tone of the conversation shifted from lighthearted banter to something much heavier. What had started as a simple question now felt like a public dissection of her very identity. Colbert's smirk faltered, the reality of his gamble beginning to hit him. He hadn't expected this. Most guests, when faced with the sharp edge of his humor, folded under pressure, offering up weak apologies or uncomfortable laughs to try and regain some control. But Karoline wasn't like most guests. She wasn't here for a late-night circus. She was here to stand her ground. She continued, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. This cross doesn't define me in the way you might think, Stephen. It's not a political tool or a weapon I use to win debates. It's my faith. And if you want to talk about it, then let's talk about what it really means. Because the truth is, you're using it as a prop for your show, but it's not a joke for me. The room was still, but the tension had shifted. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It had become a battleground for something deeper. Stephen Colbert, for all his wit and experience, was facing something that could not be dismissed with a punchline. He had struck at a sensitive, raw nerve, and Karoline, in an instant, had taken full control of the conversation. But Colbert wasn't about to back down. He had built his career on moments like this, sharp, witty retorts that cut to the heart of his guests, exposing their weaknesses, forcing them to face their discomforts. He smiled, but it was a forced smile, one that couldn't mask the growing uncertainty in his eyes. "Oh, come on, Karoline. I didn't mean to make it into some grand debate. I just wanted to know, does that cross help you win votes? Or is it a reminder that you're the good guy in this political circus?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably at his words. The laughter that had followed his earlier quip now seemed forced. They didn't know whether to applaud Karoline for standing up for herself, or to fall back on the comforting idea that Colbert's sharp humor was always the final word. But Karoline wasn't about to let the situation become just another late-night joke at her expense. "Let me ask you something, Stephen," Karoline shot back, her voice growing stronger, her presence undeniable. "How many times have you made a joke at someone's expense without thinking about the real people behind it? How many times has your audience laughed at something they didn't understand? Something that didn't fit neatly into your narrative?" Her words landed with force, and for the first time that evening Colbert was visibly taken aback. His usual quick wit seemed to falter, replaced by a brief moment of uncertainty. Could it be that the late-night host, master of the sarcastic, Barb, had finally encountered someone who could stand toe-to-toe with him, refusing to be a punchline? The audience, once on edge, now felt a wave of sympathy for Karoline. They were witnessing something rare, a woman standing her ground against one of the most powerful voices in late-night television, refusing to be dismissed, refusing to be reduced to a caricature. As Colbert fumbled for a response, the live audience began to shift, their allegiance now torn. Was Karoline a victim of Colbert's sharp-edged humor, or was she the courageous figure who had brought him back to reality? In that moment it became clear. Karoline Leavitt was not just a guest. She was a force, unyielding in her conviction. She was here not to be entertained, but to change the narrative, whether Colbert liked it or not. The question now wasn't whether she would survive this moment. It was whether Colbert could regain control of the stage, or if she had already won. The atmosphere inside the studio was thick with tension. The audience, who had initially tuned in for a lighthearted late-night interview, now found themselves caught in the middle of a high-stakes verbal duel. It wasn't just the words being exchanged. It was the realization that something much deeper was at play. Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a political figure. She had transformed into a symbol of defiance, a voice willing to speak truth to power in the very heart of the entertainment world. Colbert, however, wasn't going to let go of his position that easily. He had spent years honing his ability to disarm and control his guests, to push them into uncomfortable corners and make them squirm. But this time was different. Karoline wasn't backing down. And the more she stood firm, the more Colbert's frustration grew. He leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting from playful jabs to something more pointed. "So what you're saying, Karoline, is that when you wear that cross, it's not a statement at all? It's just something personal?" His eyes narrowed as he tried to catch her off guard, attempting to provoke her into a defensive position. "You expect people to believe that? In a world where everything has become a political symbol, where everything gets scrutinized, and where people like you use their faith to push an agenda?" The words were sharp, biting, and yet there was an underlying hint of doubt. Colbert, for the first time that night, wasn't sure if he had the moral high ground. Could he truly claim that everything Karoline stood for was part of a larger, manipulative narrative? Was her faith just another tool in the political machine, or was he missing something entirely? Karoline's eyes didn't flinch. She didn't waver. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, as if preparing to deliver a final blow. "You're right, Stephen. Faith is personal," she said, her voice now laced with a quiet power. "But it's also public, and that's exactly the point. For years, people have tried to silence voices like mine, reduce us to stereotypes, make our beliefs something to mock. But I'm here to tell you that it's not a joke. My faith, my values, they shape who I am. Not just in the voting booth, but in the way I live, the way I speak, and yes, even the way I interact with people like you." The audience, which had previously been uncertain, now began to stir. There was a palpable shift in the room as Karoline spoke, an undeniable sense that the moment had gone beyond entertainment and into something much more meaningful. This wasn't just about a cross around her neck. It was about the very foundation of who she was and what she stood for. Colbert's response was quick, but it lacked the sharpness it once had. "So you're saying that people like me, people who make jokes about these things, shouldn't even try to question it?" he asked, his tone now tinged with frustration. "That we're not allowed to make light of things like faith, or that everything is somehow off-limits?" "I'm not saying you can't make jokes," Karoline responded, her voice unwavering. "But when those jokes are used to belittle and divide people based on their beliefs, that's where I draw the line. If we're going to have a conversation, it needs to be about respect, not mockery. It's not about silencing voices. It's about having the courage to have tough conversations without tearing each other down in the process." Her words were met with a tense silence. Colbert shifted in his seat, unsure of how to respond. The audience, once on edge, was now completely captivated. No one had expected this kind of confrontation on a late-night talk show, especially not with someone who had the confidence to push back against Colbert's sharp humor and biting commentary. The dynamic in the room had shifted irreparably, and for once, Colbert wasn't in control of the narrative. But he wasn't about to let go of the fight. "I get it," he said, trying to regain his footing. "But don't you think that people like you use these platforms to preach to the choir? You're talking to people who already agree with you. You're not changing minds." Karoline's gaze never wavered. "And don't you think, Stephen, that's what's wrong with all of this? Everyone is so eager to preach to their own choir, to build their own echo chambers. The truth is, we're all just people, trying to figure out how to coexist, even if we don't always agree. The point is, we should be able to talk without tearing each other down." The audience, caught in the middle of this ideological battle, felt the weight of her words. This was no longer a lighthearted exchange. It was a confrontation that had revealed deeper truths about the nature of discourse in today's polarized world. Karoline had taken the stage not as a guest, but as a voice for something larger, something that transcended politics and entertainment. As the conversation continued, the question lingered in the air. Could Colbert recover from this moment? Or had Karoline Leavitt, with her calm strength and unshakable resolve, already won the night? The intensity in the studio was palpable, and every word exchanged between Colbert and Karoline seemed to magnify the pressure in the room. Colbert, the master of turning guests into punchlines, had never been faced with an opponent like Karoline. She wasn't just pushing back, she was making him question his own approach. For the first time in years, Colbert found himself on the defensive, struggling to regain the upper hand in a conversation he had expected to control. His usual biting humor, his signature weapon, now felt empty in the face of her unwavering composure. For a moment he hesitated. Could he continue to mock her, or had he pushed too far? The laughter that usually followed his jabs was now replaced by a cold silence, with the audience unsure of which way the conversation would tip. Colbert's eyes narrowed and he straightened up in his chair, attempting to reassert dominance. "All right, Karoline," he said, his tone attempting to mask the uncertainty creeping in. "You've made your point, but do you really think that you're going to change anyone's mind on this stage? You know what they say about preaching to the choir. So what's the point of this then? What's the end game here?" It was clear that Colbert was still searching for some way to regain control, but Karoline's response wasn't what he expected. She didn't take the bait to go further into political territory, didn't engage in the back and forth about who had the stronger argument. Instead, she chose a different path, one that left Colbert no room to maneuver. "The point, Stephen, is that we've lost the ability to talk to each other," she said quietly but with an undeniable authority. "We're so focused on winning arguments, on making sure our side is the loudest, that we've forgotten how to have real conversations. This isn't just about me or you. It's about what kind of world we want to live in. A world where faith is mocked, where people are pitted against each other for sport, or a world where we actually listen to each other." The sincerity in her voice was striking. The crowd, which had been divided in its loyalties, was now drawn to her. They hadn't expected this moment of honesty. They hadn't expected Karoline to turn a late-night interview into a powerful statement about unity, about bridging the gap in an era of extreme division. Karoline wasn't trying to win this argument. She was trying to make a point about something far more important: the ability to talk without tearing each other down. And as she spoke, it became clear that she wasn't just fighting for her own beliefs. She was fighting for a more respectful, more civil conversation in the public sphere. Stephen Colbert, for all his cleverness, was momentarily at a loss. He leaned back, his expression softening as he listened to her words. There was something about Karoline's sincerity that cut through the layers of humor and sarcasm that usually ruled the show. Could it be that the world was tired of the same old combative narratives? Were they ready for a new kind of dialogue? The audience, sensing the shift, was now fully engaged. No longer just passive spectators, they were participants in this rare, uncomfortable, and strangely cathartic moment. What started as a confrontation about a simple cross had transformed into a much deeper conversation about the nature of discourse, respect, and the politics of public life. And then, as if on cue, the sound of applause rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just a polite round of clapping, it was a heartfelt response. The energy in the room had changed completely. The audience wasn't just applauding her for standing her ground. They were applauding her for bringing something real, something human, into the often sterile world of late-night television. Karoline had done what few could ever manage. She had turned the tide in a conversation that had begun with mockery and transformed it into a platform for something meaningful. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She had taken control of the show. And for the first time in the evening, Colbert, the man who had mastered the art of cutting down his guests, was the one left questioning his own approach. Would Colbert let this moment define the rest of the interview? Could he recover from the turn that Karoline had just initiated? Or was it too late for him to regain his usual sharp edge? The real question now was whether Stephen Colbert could, for once, admit that in this conversation, Karoline Leavitt had outshone him. The silence that had fallen over the studio was almost deafening. Colbert, typically so comfortable in this environment, seemed to be grappling with something he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, the words he had carefully crafted were failing him. Karoline Leavitt had not only held her ground, she had turned the entire conversation into a reflection on the state of public discourse, faith, and respect in an increasingly polarized world. As the applause from the audience began to die down, Colbert shifted in his chair, attempting to find his usual rhythm. "Well, I'll admit, that's a different perspective, Karoline," he said, his voice softer than it had been all night. "I didn't expect that from you. I thought we were just having a little fun with a cross, but it looks like we've gone a lot deeper than I anticipated." Karoline nodded, her expression steady but thoughtful. "I understand it's hard to take a conversation like this seriously when you're used to making jokes. But I think it's important to remember that even humor can have a deeper purpose, if we choose to listen." There was a subtle shift in Colbert's demeanor. The smile that had been plastered on his face all evening was now gone, replaced by a more reflective look. He had been rattled by her words, her conviction, and the fact that this moment had evolved into something bigger than just a late-night quip. He hesitated before continuing, his voice now measured. "I'm not sure where that leaves us, Karoline, but I think you've made your point. I don't know if I agree with everything you said, but I can respect the conviction behind it. And I think, at least for tonight, you've proven that there's more than one way to have a conversation." It was a rare moment of acknowledgement from Stephen Colbert. He wasn't admitting defeat, but he was certainly acknowledging that Karoline had won this particular battle. She hadn't fallen into his trap. She hadn't allowed herself to be reduced to a caricature. Instead, she had used the platform to shift the conversation into something meaningful, something that resonated far beyond the stage. The audience, once unsure of where they stood, now erupted in applause. This wasn't just about the clash between Colbert and Karoline. It was about the message she had brought with her. It was about the reminder that conversations didn't always have to be about winning or losing. They could be about finding common ground, even in the most unlikely places. For Karoline, this moment wasn't about scoring a victory in the traditional sense. It wasn't about one-upping Stephen Colbert or making him look foolish. It was about something bigger, something that transcended politics, faith, and entertainment. It was about the courage to stand firm in her beliefs, even when the odds were stacked against her. It was about showing the world that real, meaningful conversations could still take place, even in the world of late-night television. As the segment wrapped up, Colbert turned to Karoline with a small, genuine smile. "Well, that's all the time we have for tonight," he said, his usual sharpness replaced with something warmer. "Karoline Leavitt, everybody. Thank you for making this one of the more interesting interviews I've had in a while." Karoline gave him a small, knowing smile in return. "Thank you for having me, Stephen. I'm glad we had this chance to talk." The final applause roared, but this time it was different. The energy in the room wasn't just about the performance of the night. It was about the unspoken respect that had been earned through a rare and authentic exchange. Karoline Leavitt had proven that she wasn't just another political figure, another talking head. She had demonstrated that when given the chance, she could stand toe-to-toe with anyone, even the most seasoned of late-night hosts, and come out the other side with her dignity and message intact. As the camera pulled away and the lights dimmed, it was clear to everyone in the studio, and to the millions watching at home, that this wasn't just another late-night segment. This had been a moment of true confrontation, where both sides had learned something, where the conversation had moved beyond the surface and into something deeper, more significant. The question lingered. Had Stephen Colbert truly expected this kind of response? And more importantly, what would the fallout be from this interview, the one where Karoline Leavitt, in a single moment, had turned the tables on him?